All right, hello and welcome back. Today we're going to move into part two in our reading here in our unit called The Civil War and the Meaning of Liberty. And in the part two is entitled Abolition and the National Politics of Slavery. Now, the very first thing that we're going to talk about is section one, which is abolition and resistance to slavery. I just recently read an article. I want to say it was a BuzzFeed article or something. And in this article, it was entitled The Top 10 Myths About Slavery. And one of the myths that was listed was that slaves were docile or passive. They just accepted their position as slaves, which, as the historians in this article had pointed out, was not true. And it is my hope to convey to you over the course of this lecture the different types of resistance that enslaved men and women had exhibited. So let's start out. So we're going to go ahead and use these same two maps here to start out. If you look at 1830, this is what the United States was looking at like at the time. There was only 24 states in 1830. And then by the time 1850 rolls around, the United States expands westward. We annex Texas in 1845, Mexico cedes California and New Mexico territory, Utah territory to the United States after the Mexican-American War, and then Oregon country was provided to us by Great Britain in 1846. So what I want to start out with here it's just a quote, and you're going to find the same exact quote in your reading, but I wanted to explain what this means, because it's a very important quote. So here, this was a quote by Senator William H. Seward of New York. This is a guy that admittedly is forgettable. You will not need to remember this guy's face. You will not need to remember this guy's name from this point forward. But he does have a very powerful quote here, and this reads, we're going to work through this slowly. Slavery has, moreover, a more natural alliance with the aristocracy, or kind of the upper class, of the North and with the aristocracy of Europe. So long as slavery shall possess the cotton fields, the sugar fields, and the rice fields of the world, so long will commerce and capital, so trading and money, yield its toleration and sympathy. Emancipation is a democratic revolution. It is capital that arrests all democratic revolutions. So that's some loaded language here. Let me try to translate this for you in simple modern day language. You have Seward's making the argument that slavery has a natural alliance with the upper class of the North as well as the upper class of Europe. That is not just a Southern institution. So, well, for as long as slavery exists in cotton fields, sugar fields, and rice fields, there commerce, meaning trading, commercial activity, commerce, and capital meaning money, commerce and capital provided toleration. The commerce and money make people tolerant of slavery and provide sympathy for the institution of slavery. Emancipation, or freedom of slaves, needs to be a democratic revolution. It needs to be a revolution of the people, but for long as money is involved, it arrests or stops or prevents all democratic revolutions. So Seward is very aware of the fact that the North is involved in this, Europe is involved in slavery, in the continuation of slavery in the American South, and so long as money is involved, as long as this is fueling economic activity in the United States, in Europe, that it's going to prevent this democratic revolution of emancipation, freeing the slaves, from taking place. So, an introduction here. A growing force was in opposition to slavery known as the abolition movement at the time. Now, abolition, we had talked about this term in class. The root word of abolition is to abolish. So to abolish means to get rid of. So you can think of the abolition movement as a movement to get rid of the institution of slavery. So black and white people aimed to abolish slavery. It was not just black people that had partaken in the abolition movement. There were whites that were involved in abolition as well. Opponents of the abolition movement had generally considered them fanatics and radicals. So a fanatic meaning somebody that's kind of a wacko, a radical, somebody that is an extremist. This is not a mainstream idea. They are a fringe left, fringe liberal idea. In the late 1700s and 1800s, northern states gradually had abolished slavery. So legally speaking, it was abolished or prohibited in northern states, but it did remain firmly rooted in the South at the time. So the tactics of opposition that we're going to talk about today are fourfold. One being resistance, the second one being rebellion, third, flight, and then you have organizing down at the very bottom. So let's start first with resistance. Enslaved people did want freedom. Let's get that clear. That's the misconception that enslaved men and women just accepted their positions and were happy to be enslaved is a falsehood. This is something that Southerners at the time they did peddle this falsehood that enslaved men, enslaved women were happy to be slaves. But that's just not true. So resistance had exhibited itself in the form of subtle yet important acts, such as working slowly, breaking tools, intentionally breaking tools, faking illness. Generally, you did not want these large, overt acts of resistance because they would come with very harsh, violent punishments, if not death. So very subtle ways, in very subtle ways, enslaved men and women had kind of fought the system, if you will. You have enslaved people had used religion, food, cooking, and music as ways to cope with their oppression. They had formed families despite the threat of separation. So it was illegal in the South for the enslaved men and women to marry and form families. But yet it did happen nonetheless. At the threat of separation, you have men and women would have children and form close-knit ties in their family, knowing very well that because of the existence of slavery, their family may be separated in the near future. Others learned to read and write in secret despite laws prohibiting, and that's what you see in this image right here, where you had enslaved people taught other enslaved people how to read and how to write. These are literacy skills that's this was illegal. To be sure, enslaved men and women were not allowed by law to be literate. Yet roughly 10% of the enslaved population knew how to read and write because of this form of resistance. Moving on to rebellion. So let's talk first about Nat Turner's rebellion. If you're talking about slave rebellion, this is the big one. So in 1831, you had an enslaved man whose name was Nat Turner. Him and 6 others had revolted and ended up killing Turner's enslaver in Virginia. Now, they didn't just stop there. These 7 individuals had moved on to other homes, eventually recruiting about 40 to 60 enslaved people at the time, and they had killed in total approximately 55 white people, including children. Well, eventually a white militia, or kind of a group of individuals that all were armed, had crushed this rebellion. Now, Turner and the 50 others that were involved in the rebellion were executed. But why is this so significant, so as to earn a spot here in your reading? Well, it had everything to do with this. So Nat Turner's rebellion had heightened the fear among many white Southerners that violent uprisings by enslaved peoples might become more widespread. So, right after, in the immediate aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion, you saw mobs of white people, angry and fearful about this rebellion, had murdered approximately 200 black people. So Nat Turner's rebellion had kind of stoked fear in Southerners that enslaved people are going to rebel and revolt against their enslavers. Let's talk about flight next. So flight, what do I mean by flight? I don't mean flying through the air. By flight, I mean fleeing slavery, fleeing plantations. So some enslaved people had risked their lives to escape and claim freedom for themselves. So from 1830 to 1860, approximately, this is estimates by historians, approximately 150,000 people had escaped slavery, fleeing towards freedom. Freedom being in northern states or Canada. The simple act of fleeing challenged this slaveholder argument that enslaved people were content with their conditions. Why would anybody flee conditions if they were happy with being enslaved? So here you have a house. I'm going to talk about the Underground Railroad in just a second, but you do have a house here in Cincinnati, Ohio, that served as what was known as a station or a safe house in the Underground Railroad. So the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, what did this do? It allowed, and this was a national law to be sure. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 had meant that escapees could be recaptured in the North and re-enslaved. So just because you had escaped slavery, that does not mean that you were suddenly guaranteed freedom. The Fugitive Slave Act had allowed Southern plantation owners to hire slave catchers. And these slave catchers would make their living, this was their job, make their living out of hunting down and returning fugitives to plantations. And you saw this in that documentary that we had watched the other day on Friday. This was depicted in that America, the Story of Us. So sometimes this resulted in legitimate free black people being kidnapped and enslaved. There were tens of thousands of free black men and women in the North, and every now and then you'd have slave catchers would kidnap a legitimately free black person and then enslave them and bring them south. So here you have a picture of a reward that would be listed. $1,000 reward for a runaway, ran away from slaveholders. And then you have the man's name is George, age 22 or 23. They list the man's height, and then the man that is with him. So the Underground Railroad. it is important to understand, because most of you have heard of the Underground Railroad, and most of you have heard of this woman right here, Harriet Tubman. The Underground Railroad was not an actual railroad. Okay, the Underground Railroad was a network of people and places that helped enslaved people escape north with the goal of escaping to Canada. So conductors in the Underground Railroad were people who helped the fugitives escape. So Harriet Tubman is the most famous of all of the Underground Railroad conductors. Fugitives that had escaped using the Underground Railroad hid in safe houses called stations. And on the previous slide here, that's what I was referring to when I said that this is an example of a station. Now, usually in the Underground Railroad, the Underground Railroad was mostly made up of was mostly conducted by black men and black women, but there were also white men and white women that also partook in the Underground Railroad as well. So abolitionist organizations, these organizations that all rallied around this idea that enslaved people should be free, had actually protected these fugitives from slave catchers. But these escapees, they have nothing when they escape slavery. I want you to think they don't have food, they don't have clothing, they don't have shelter. So abolitionist organizations really stepped up to provide them with protection from slave catchers, and also raised funds to provide escapees with housing, food, and jobs. So here's a map of the Underground Railroad as we know it. So let's walk through this map really quick. You have the light beige states and territories were free states. The darker beige were slave states. So you see Texas, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky. They're all the same shade of beige. These are the slave states down here in the South. And all of when you see all these arrows here, these dashed arrows, they represent Underground Railroad routes. So you have enslaved people would make their way north, but the goal is to not just stop in Illinois, but the goal is to make their way all the way to Canada. Missouri, they're escaping into Kansas territory, Nebraska territory, going to Iowa. You see in Texas, Underground Railroad routes led to Mexico, where slavery was also illegal. So you see all of these different routes existing, but generally speaking, they're all leading to the same places, which is Canada, Mexico, or places where slavery was prohibited. Organizing. What were the National Black Conventions? So when I use the word organization, I mean people that are forming a group that all rally behind a specific cause. So what were the National Black Conventions? These were free black people who organized national and state conventions in the North. Now, women did partake in these national black conventions. However, the most influential delegates tended to be educated black men. The goal of these national black conventions in the North was to strategize around issues including slavery, abolition, and human rights. And these national black conventions worked to achieve greater rights for free black people, including political rights such as the right to vote, which after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, black men and women do receive this right, but then it is soon thereafter taken away again up until the 1960s, which we're going to talk about far from now in the second semester of this class. They also These national black conventions also fought for legal rights and increased educational and employment opportunity for free black people in the North. What arguments did abolitionists make against slavery? So, when it comes to the abolition movements, I don't want you to think that it was just one. I don't want you to think that it's a movement that had a consistent message among all members. Rather, abolitionists held a range of views. You had many argued that slavery was immoral and unjust. And those who argued this usually based this belief in religion, specifically Christianity. This belief that all are born equal in the eyes of God. And so you had many religious people at the time thought that, well, if all are born equal in the eyes of God, then why do we have an institution where people are placed in chains, forced to work, whipped, beaten? So that seems to be a pretty consistent idea amongst all abolitionists. But there were some other abolitionists that didn't necessarily believe in full equality. Others believed that slavery should be abolished, which makes them an abolitionist, but blacks and whites should remain socially, I forgot an ly there, should remain socially separate. So they didn't believe in slavery, but they didn't quite believe in full equality either. Almost all abolitionists had recounted or had remembered the abuse and suffering that slaveholders inflicted on enslaved people, which contributed to their opposition to slavery. The brutality of it made them cringe. And they argued that slavery contradicted the promise of liberty and equality laid out in founding documents of the United States. We already looked at that political cartoon yesterday that showed a Southerner, the guy with the donkey ears, you might remember him. He had his foot on the Constitution of the United States, and he also was yelling at the abolitionists in ordering the abolitionists to be hanged because this man had the audacity to believe that all men are born free and equal. Well, that terminology, that language is from the Declaration of Independence. And he was also stepping on the Constitution. And those two documents there are founding documents of the United States. So why did many people oppose the abolition movements? Northerners also opposed the abolition movement. Not all Northerners, but many Northerners. That white supremacy was pervasive, not just in the South, but also in the North as well. White supremacy being this idea that white people are supreme or superior to all other races and ethnicities. So there are many in the North that didn't believe in abolition. Certainly many in the South didn't believe in it, but there were also those in the North that didn't believe in it either. Usually it was those with financial interests in preserving slavery that spoke out against slavery. Some argue the Constitution had protected slavery. They would point to the protection of property rights. At this time, you have to understand that slaves were not viewed as people. That enslaved men and enslaved women were viewed by Southern plantation owners as property. And the argument was made that if this is my property, I have a right to my property, and the government cannot take my property away without good cause. And they usually point to the due process clause of the Constitution, saying that the government cannot take away your life, liberty, or property without due process of law, without giving you all of the legal processes that you are entitled to. The ironic part there is, while Southern plantation owners were really focused on that word property, they're conveniently ignoring the life and liberty part of the due process clauses to the Constitution, that the government can't take away your life, liberty, or property. Well, the irony here is that they were taking away lives. Of their slaves. They were killing enslaved men and women, and plantation owners were certainly taking away the liberty of their enslaved people. But once again, they didn't view their enslaved people, as human beings. They viewed their enslaved people as property. The last thing I'm going to talk about today is the legal challenges to slavery. So how did the courts further the cause of abolition? Well, abolitionists filed court cases to defend freedom of formerly enslaved people who escaped to free territory and protected free blacks that were kidnapped by slave catchers. So abolitionists were filing these cases on behalf of these groups. Now, in court cases such as Commonwealth versus Aves, which took place in 1836, Commonwealth versus Aves was a case where a slave owner had brought I want to say it was a 6-year-old girl north to Massachusetts. The 6-year-old girl was an enslaved girl. Well, while in Massachusetts, there was a court case that was filed against the slave owner, and the argument was that you brought your enslaved girl to a free state. If slavery is prohibited in this state, and you are now in this state, even temporarily, that girl gets her freedom. It's illegal here. There's no slavery in Massachusetts. Well, they won. The abolitionists, that is. The abolitionists won that case. And Commonwealth versus Aves established that enslaved people brought to Massachusetts, even for a short trip, had a right to freedom. And this set a precedent, set the foundation for similar laws and court cases in Connecticut and New York. So Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts then established that if a slave owner from the South, an enslaver is how I should phrase it, if an enslaver from the South goes north and brings with him or her an enslaved man or woman or child, that enslaved person obtains their freedom upon entering a free state. But I don't want you to believe that all court cases were positive. The next question here is, how did the courts protect the interest of slaveholders and set back the causes of abolition? So there were legal setbacks as well. In Prigg versus Pennsylvania in 1842, this court case was heard in the Supreme Court of the United States, and it upheld the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. To uphold a law means to find it constitutional, therefore legitimate. They did not strike this law down. So the Supreme Court, and that's what SCOTUS stands for here, it's Supreme Court of the United States. I'm going to be writing that quite often on my slides in this course. Just know that SCOTUS stands for Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court had claimed that northern state laws, such as those that were created in Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut, contradicted the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and were thus unconstitutional. The argument by the Supreme Court here was that state law does not trump federal law. Federal law, meaning national law, trumps state law. And so, therefore, the states did not have the authority to establish laws that were in contradiction or in opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act. And this really dealt a harsh blow to northern states that had enacted personal liberty laws to protect enslaved and free blacks. All right, that's all I have for you today. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.